Welcome to the Ascends at Boston Avenue Podcast. I'm Philip Boone, and I use he, him, his pronouns.
And I'm Caitlin Drake. I use female pronouns she, her, hers.
Before we begin, I'd like to state that the views represented in this podcast are those of the individuals in this conversation and not the official position of Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. Joining us for this conversation is Reverend David Wiggs and our special guest, Rabbi Michael Zedek. Currently serving as Rabbi in residence at St. Paul's School of Theology, Rabbi Zedek previously served as senior rabbi at two great congregations, the Temple Congregation B'nai Yehuda in Greater Kansas City, Missouri, and Emmanuel Congregation in Chicago, Illinois. Welcome, Reverend Wiggs and Rabbi Zedek.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Rabbi, you presented on several problematic texts in the Hebrew Bible this weekend, and one of the things you shared was in Jewish tradition, to understand a text in its literal form is to miss the meanings of the text. Can you explain this more for our listeners?
Oh, people were taking serious notes. My goodness. Yeah. The assumption of Jewish tradition from its origins has been that we wrestle with sacred literature because there are meanings in it that impact who we are and who we might become. That means that the text doesn't just have one specific all-for-all-time instruction. It may mean something to us because of our life situation at one moment and a different thing or not anything at another moment. But it fundamentally suggests that there's a richness in these stories because whatever history is in the Hebrew Bible, it is not just a historical document or not even principally a historical document. It's far more a spiritual autobiography than anything else. And is not one's autobiography filled with nuance and alternative approaches and moments of clarity and moments of confusion? So why wouldn't that be true as we examine the religious text that is fundamental for Western civilization?
So one of the things that struck me this weekend...
I hope so.
Just one of many, but one that stood out to me was when you were talking about certain texts in the Hebrew Scriptures that are literally unbelievable. For example, the Jacob and Esau story and the goat skin on the hands. Who's going to believe that? My kind of personal religious journey was I left church, didn't do anything with religion, was very anti-religion for a big period of time, and now I'm here. So there was some things in the middle.
Some journey in the middle, yeah.
But a big criticism of religion from those in the outside communities is there's unbelievable stuff in here. Mm-hmm. And you presented that unbelievable stuff is in there for a reason. Mm-hmm. What is that reason? What do we do with that?
First of all, I think there's a difference between facts and truth, that stories are compelling to us because they tell us something out there and something within ourselves. Otherwise, why do we engage at all? That's A. B, I think often, not always, but often the journey is filled with detours because somebody taught us a lie. And when we recognize that it's an untruth, there is often an angry response of, I cannot trust you. For instance, most folks grow up with a Santa Claus version of theology. God's making a list. God is checking it twice, finding out who's naughty or nice. The song essentially says, if you're a good boy or girl, you're going to get a reward. If you're a bad boy or girl, you're going to get it in the neck. So why the last line? So be good for goodness sake? It's the only honest line in the whole song, which is to say, you could almost suggest it's a secret teaching. Well, at some point, many of us grow up with the notion that there's ambiguity in our lives. Why would that not apply to how we approach and engage with everything, including biblical tradition and maybe even religion? The big challenge is we teach religion to children as though it's a childish enterprise. It's an adult business because it's all about the ultimate question of, is there meaning at the heart of existence? Many of us resist that. There's an exquisite suggestion that's attributed to Ralph Waldo Emerson. Nobody can find where he said it, but it's attributed to him, so why not? The gods we worship write their names upon our faces. And be sure of it, we will worship something. We may think that our worship is carried out in secret, but it behooves us to be careful what we are worshiping. For what we are worshiping, the issue isn't God or no God. Everyone has a even with a small g, God, what my ultimate value is, what I express worship. And most of us, alas, engage in idolatry, whether it's the idolatry of nationalism or the idolatry of I got to spend more time at the officeism. But one of the things that's clear always about idolatry is it always demands human sacrifice. And I think the religious message is in opposition to that in a deep way, in a storytelling way. My goodness, if Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels can be taken as a sarcastic description of life in England and Ireland, why can't we apply the same standards to sacred literature? I don't understand why we wouldn't.
When you talked about, when you were dealing with the group as we were discussing what you call problematic text in the Hebrew Scriptures, you distinguished 4 different ways of interpretation. Would you reiterate those for us? Because I think those are helpful.
I even remember that.
Yeah. So often I think part of the idolatry in Christianity becomes I have the right belief or I have the right doctrine, and if you disagree with me, then not just that you disagree with me, but somehow you're banished from the faithful. Not my personal belief. I don't approach religion or spirituality that way, but some do within our family. I thought your 4 different levels of interpretation were really helpful.
Well, truthfully, to be honest, it's not my 4, but you know.
Right.
It's from the beginning of rabbinic traditions wrestling with the text. They understood that there were a minimum, I emphasize the minimum, of 4 levels on which each text could be understood, unpacked, probed for meaning. The first level, the Hebrew word for that is peshat, which means the literal meaning. The sea split and they walked through on dry ground. The second level is remez, which means hint or clue, which is to say if you would apply the critical faculties that you can and possess and apply to anything else and apply them to the Hebrew Bible, you might come up with some nuances, as I suggested the other day. What about mud? How could they have walked through on dry ground? The third level is drash, which literally means the ethical teaching, the lesson. It's also the modern Hebrew word for a sermon, by the way. And the fourth level is sod, the secret meaning, the so be good for goodness sake piece of the puzzle. Because we all know, even though we teach children, that we can't explain the suffering of good people and the prosperity of evil. We know that, but we don't want to know that. So anyway, those 4 levels form a Hebrew word called pardes, which is the Hebrew word for orchard, which is a wonderful notion of you're exploring an orchard filled with wondrous gifts, fruits. It's also the origin of the English word pardes, paradise. Not an accident.
Thanks. That's really helpful, I think.
To me, at least.
Yes, to me too, and I think to our listeners.
You also presented this weekend on Miracles of the Ordinary and have been working on a book around the same topic. What is the miracle of the ordinary?
It's not a singular, unless you want to say the whole gestalt of experience is that miracle, and I would accept that. The book, which my agent changed the title to Hiding in Plain Sight, A Journey to Everyday Spirituality, and the title after the colon is important because it's a journey, it's not a destination, and it's a lifelong journey that one might find some worthiness in taking those steps. There are people who won't and don't. But what I mean by miracles of the ordinary is, as I suggested, we are all likely to divide the world into extraordinary and ordinary. And it takes no great wisdom to recognize the extraordinary because we have to acknowledge it. It slaps us across the face and says, pay attention to me. The ordinary, what do we do with it, is equally clear. We take it for granted. And my bromide is if we could find ways to take the ordinary for granted less, our lives would be more filled with life. Notice I said less, because I don't know anyone who can live in that intensity at all times. Because otherwise, you'd get up in the morning and that was the last thing you do because you're surrounded by miracle. And you yourself are as well miracle. Now what? Oh boy. So it just seems to me not unlike what we talked about earlier about lies, but the deepest truth is that it is that part of the experience that allows us to take this very brief journey before eternity, because that's what it is, whether it's 100 years or 60 years or 12 years, and make it a sacred pilgrimage. The more and more intensely we can recognize that it's not only in the high points, it's not only on Mount Sinai, but it's in the valley to which you return to from the Sinai moment. One of the things that's wonderful about the Sinai story is when Moses comes down from the mountain, the text says his face shone. but he didn't know his face shone. He had to be told that. And maybe we all have to be told that even though we're not Moses, there can be a moment in our lives when we recognize this is also a moment of holiness where we walk on sacred ground, where a bush burns unconsumed, and we notice it. We pay attention to it, and we celebrate it. That's some of what the book's about.
One of the things that struck me this weekend after your presentation on Miracle of the Ordinary was the complementariness of that thinking to so many of our spiritual practices. So we're running a spiritual practices Lenten workshop. So one of the practices is around gratitude, which to me felt there's an intersection there, along with mindfulness was another one. So I didn't know if you dive into those kinds of concepts and how they intersect or not.
Sure. Well, the manuscript does, whether I do or not. And one of the things that is fascinating to me about Jewish prayer is it is much more about able to be summarized as a thank you, thank you, thank you, as opposed to please, please, please. Because, as it were, to cite a cliche in effect, if we can count our blessings, we have more blessings because we're able to count them, you know? And the notion that somehow there's a confluence in spiritual practice does not surprise, because one of my ways of experiencing the religious dimension in the world is an awareness that I think is accurate, that all religions are simply languages to try to express and encourage us toward the ultimate. That's another word for G-O-D. And the notion that English is superior to French is ridiculous. Now, there are some things that might be more nuanced and expressed in an exquisite way that I can understand in my particular language, although some people think French is the perfect language for amour, right? But it's silly to say English is better than French. It is similar and different from French. So why wouldn't it? It's a way to clarify. Spirituality, a way to clarify. And what would surprise if the human needs are overlapping, that there would not be a confluence of the ways we do it.
Speaking of the idea that our religions are really pointing in a similar direction, there are some places where Judaism and Christianity diverge. And one of them that we talked about at our staff lunch today is around the afterlife. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Depending on one's metaphor, Judaism is either a mother that gave birth to Christianity as a daughter, or Judaism is a sibling and Christianity is a sibling. I mean, however one wants to play it. But for purposes of responding, it's a little bit easier to use the symbolism of mother-daughter, because mother and daughter have much in common, and mother and daughter are not the same. It would be shocking if they were. That would mean they were twins or clone, as opposed to a product of. In some ways, especially because Paul is really the shaper of Christianity, Paul is immersed in the Greek world, and he comes from the Jewish world. And the Greek world is far more concerned with soteria or soteria, which is a fancy-schmancy Greek word for salvation, than the Hebrew world. He shapes a message about the meaning of Jesus, who after all lives and dies a Jew, into a vehicle for the salvific experience, which is so much at the heart of his need, desire, and understanding of what Jesus meant and means. He had remarkable success in the Greek world, which is also involved in soteria and also a body-soul dualism. He had less success in the Jewish world, because the Jewish world was far less concerned with how do we get back with God, because we didn't know we were separated from God, and far more concerned with how do we bring God into this world, as opposed to what I suggested at our luncheon meeting, getting into God's world when we die. Jewish tradition tends to suggest that that'll take care of itself, because we trust God on that sort of thing. But while we're here, our job is to be a place where God comes in with us and with others. Christianity shares that, but it also has another emphasis, which is how it became its own tradition, not just another Judaism. And I celebrate that.
In one of our meetings earlier, you also talked about aspects that in the Hebrew Bible that are misunderstood. Would you be able to mention to us and let our listeners know what are aspects, or maybe is there a misunderstanding around in the Hebrew Bible?
If I said that, I want to clarify, because I'm not sure that there are aspects that are misunderstood. There are aspects that may be understood differently, okay? One of which, I even mentioned this in my sermon, I think the deep construct of the Hebrew Bible isn't just that you're looking at a history book. It is that, as I said earlier, a spiritual autobiography. So that, to use a phrase somewhat similar to what I talked about on Sunday morning, these stories are essential. Not just because they may have happened, or perhaps did happen, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, but also because they happen here and now, in you and me, always. And they're timeless, not just from a time in the past. Otherwise, what do I have to learn from it? I mean, what is my engagement with it? How might I grow because of it, unless it speaks to my current circumstance? Now, you could argue that's just all a bunch of stuff that you're throwing on the text because you need it to be meaningful. But in continuing encounters seem to me to reveal that I'm right. I'll put it in another way. I remember having an experience with a more literalist-minded, you should forgive the expression, fundamentalist minister. And for him, the texts are inerrant, or the whole thing falls apart, right? That is, without error, or without human input. And aside, in rabbinic tradition, in the Talmud, there's a joke. You know, if Moses wrote the Hebrew Bible, how did he write the last lines of Deuteronomy where he's dead? Or for that matter, why would he say, these are the words that Moses spoke on the other side of the Jordan, since he never got to the side of the Jordan, which would say it was the other side, right? And the rabbis say that Moses wrote the last lines of Deuteronomy with tears in his eyes, which is their way of saying, oh, come on, folks, pay attention. We're dealing with depth here, not with literalism here. There is, for me, a distinction in these texts as in no other. Because, you know, one could say Shakespeare. Why not just study Shakespeare? Because he certainly yields great insights, does he not? You know, Shakespeare would presumably be easily understood as the greatest expression, at least in English, perhaps in world literature, of a human perspective, the human condition. For me, the Bible is an effort to understand a divine perspective on the human story. And since it is a human effort to understand the divine perspective on the human story, it has great wisdom in moments where maybe it wasn't precisely that way. Okay? That makes sense to me. And it's compelling to me. And it's challenging to me. And once in a while, comforting to me. By which I mean the stuff that comes out of it in my encounter with it.
Well, we've talked about a sense of uniqueness in terms of how Scripture's written, where it includes the foibles and the failures of the protagonist or the lead characters. For Christian Scripture, where the hero gets crucified.
Talk about failure.
All right.
Yeah.
It goes sideways on you. So there is that perspective that you've discussed some with us in terms of how Scripture captures that in a way different than lots of literature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure, David, for sure. I couldn't agree more that these texts are vital because I have something about me in them, even if it's not yet discovered about me. I like to think of the Hebrew Bible in another frame as a book of sacred anthropology more than a book of theology. It's got more to say about us than it does about God.
So I asked you about this earlier, so it's not a surprise question.
Right, I gave a better answer the last time.
Within the context particularly of Protestant churches, we have a lot of consternation around the numbers that are showing declining church attendance, declining giving, just low numbers. Mm-hmm. Is that something that you have witnessed in your time as senior rabbi that plagues Jewish communities as well? And what do you see as some of the greatest challenges facing institutionalized religion?
Yeah. Well, everyone says the fastest growing religious community is nuns, as in I don't mean NU, I mean non-affiliated. And certainly a secular mentality that I don't need a religious group is growing. But we live in communities or we die. And so I think everyone forthrightly, seeks out a community, even if it's the wrong community. We all have a hunger, and that hunger will be fed, oftentimes by things that are not good for us, but it will be fed. For me, there's no question, as I observe it, that affiliation in the Jewish world is challenged in America, and affiliation in so-called mainstream Protestantism is challenged, and in the Catholic world, dioceses and churches are closing like crazy, right? There's a book that was written many years ago called The Ever-Dying People, which is to say every generation thinks that it's the last generation, and fortunately, so far, they've always been wrong. I mentioned when we discussed this at an earlier meeting that I have no problem with the notion that the Christian world, not unlike Boston Avenue United Methodist Church, can survive and thrive not as part of the majority culture. Christianity is supposed to be a protest against the majority culture, a meaningful expression of an alternative to the majority culture. Judaism has a long-standing experience with that. We have never been a large group, but hopefully we're a group that can make a difference with other groups. That seems to me to be the real work, not to worry about, oh my gosh, our numbers are decreasing. I think it'd be worthwhile to learn some of what people find off-putting, that they don't come in the doors, but I also think sometimes the doors are the barrier. The church is not the building. The church is the community. I think that's probably true of synagogues too. Even though you have a great building, by the way. But it's an envelope.
Are there other components of what you've prepared to talk about this weekend, or topics that you're just really excited about?
As we're meeting, I've yet to do my concluding lecture, which is called Folklore and Stories, A Window to the Soul. And it is based on, before I became a rabbi, I taught literature. And one of the things that's fascinating is that scholars of literature claim there are only 7 basic plots. Some scholars now argue there are only 6. By the way, Tolstoy argued, and pretend you haven't heard this, I'm going to start with this tonight. There are only 2 stories. The first story begins, I went on a long journey. The second story begins, a stranger came to town. Now that's incredible. Here's a fancy word for you, pleonastic. It embraces a whole bunch of stuff. But if there are only a certain number of stories, how different cultures tell, now I got quotation marks around the 6th word, the same story, is a remarkable window into that culture's specific values and how those values may penetrate our souls. I'll give you one example in 2 stories. And again, you must pretend, wow, what a great story tonight, okay? The first story comes from Buddhist tradition. A woman's only child dies. She goes to see the Buddha. Restore my child to life. After all, he's the Buddha. He says to her, bring me a mustard seed from a home that has not known sorrow. Interesting, mustard seed in New Testament, right? A mustard seed, and I will restore your child to life. And she understands what the Buddha is teaching her. There's no such home. And she leaves, resigned to her fate. The Jewish version of the same story. A woman's only child dies. She goes to see, we pronounce it Elisha, the one after Elijah. How do you pronounce it? Elisha. And it's the right one for tradition to pick because in the Hebrew Bible, he does a CPR like reviving a child who seems to have died. Restore my child to life. He says to her, guess what he says to her? Bring me a mustard seed from a home that has not known sorrow, and I'll restore your child to life. So far, it's the same story, right? Now it becomes a Jewish story. She goes looking. No one could imagine, you've given me the key, I'm going to search for it. Many years later, they meet. And one of the amazing details, he recognizes her. They don't recognize each other. He says to her, why didn't you come back to me? And she says, at first, I was desperately looking for that mustard seed that would restore my child to life. But I found in every home I entered there was pain. And I was too busy trying to relieve pain to return to you. Now, the Buddhist story teaches a wisdom. It's the wisdom of acceptance. It's sort of what makes the East what it is. What is what is what is. And our task is to adjust to it. The Jewish story teaches the wisdom of wrestling, of struggle. There's a difference between the world as it is and the world as it should be. Children shouldn't die from parents. It happens, and it will continue to. But we will strive mightily, tilting at windmills to strive to make it less likely. The wisdom of struggle and the wisdom of acceptance. By the way, sometimes we do embrace the wrong wisdom. The other small footnote is she will never get well, but she can get better, as opposed to getting bitter. And the only way to get better is you help others with their pain. That's a piece of what I'm going to talk about tonight.
Thank you so much for joining us
Thank
today.
you. My privilege.
This has been the Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast. Our theme music was composed and performed by Wyatt Smith. Boston Avenue United Methodist Church is a progressive historic church located in downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma. Please visit our social media platforms for more information on what's going on at Boston Avenue UMC. We can be found on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. We'll talk to you next time. Thank you.